Shouting, gunfire, and the purr of steam engines whirring in the water filled the air. The ships poised at one another threateningly, both barely out of the water like a pair of alligators. The soldiers aboard manned their stations, firing guns and repeating their commander's orders. These little-known battles didn't just mean life or death for these soldiers. These were the little-known battles that meant winning or losing the American Civil War. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this, let's look at some historical context. The American Civil War lasted from April 12, 1861 to April 9th of 1865, and it was a domestic war where the Union, or North, was against the rebellious Confederates, or South. The Union comprised of the states of California, Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin. On the Confederate side of things, the states of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia united. The main subject of this war was slavery and whether or not it was constitutional. Most of the northern states were staunchly opposed, and slavery was facing abolition. The South was heavily reliant on slave labor for their plantations, as this was a huge revenue source in this area. So they seceded from the United States of America. In the beginning of the war, combat was largely fought with bayonets, horses, wooden ships, and imprecise artillery. During the course of the war, weaponry changed and the new standards emerged, like mines, accurate guns, deadlier bullets, torpedoes, and ironclad ships. Most of the fighting was on land, like the Battle of Gettysburg. However, there was a critical element of the war that was struggle at sea. This was because it was crucial to control the coastline. Whichever side could do that would control shipping imports from Europe and coastal America, which had critical resources such as food, clothes, medicine, artillery, and occasionally reinforcement. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. Navy had 90 warships, 42 of them being in commission and the rest were on foreign station. Fortunately for the Union, President Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy was incredibly competent, and his name was Gideon Welles, and his assistant, Gustavus Vasa Fox, was just as able. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, they had to start with nothing for their Navy. They did as well as they did because of their quite capable Secretary of their Navy, Stephen Mallory. He sent agents to Europe to purchase warships, refurbished captured or scuttled Union warships, and made every effort to arm and purchase Southern-owned ships in Confederate ports. His only major failure was his delay in seeing the advantage of Confederate government control of blockade runners bringing in strategic supplies. It wasn't until later in the war that the Confederate government began closer supervision of blockade-running ships. Eventually, they commandeered space on all privately owned blockade runners and even built and operated some of their own in the late stages of the war. By the time of General Robert E. Lee's surrender, Lincoln's Navy ballooned to 626 warships, 65 of which were ironclads. The Navy was a tiny force of 9,000 sailors in 1861, and at the end of the war there were roughly 59,000 sailors. Naval appropriations per year jumped from $12 million to somewhere around $123 million, and the blockade of about 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline was a factor of incalculable value in the final defeat of the Southern government of Jefferson Finis Davis. Though we do have to note the blockade wasn't truly effective until the end of 1863. The naval side of the Civil War was revolutionary. There was an increasing use of steam power, the screw propeller, shell guns, and rifled ordnance, with both sides building their own ironclads. The battle between the North's Monitor and the South's Virginia was the first battle ever fought between ironclads, and as we will look at in greater depth this Sunday, the Confederate submersible H.L. Hunley sank USS Housatonic, the first time a combat submarine sank a warship ever. And speaking of Sunday, if you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show Shipwreck Sunday every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Alright, let's continue with the navies of the American Civil War. Daring Confederate Sea Raiders preyed on Union commerce vessels. The most successful of these raiders were the Sumter, commanded by Raphael Semmes, and the Sumter captured 18 Northern merchantmen early in the war. Another noteworthy one was Florida, captained by John Maffitt, which seized 37 Union prizes in 1863 in the North and South Atlantic. And finally, the Shenandoah, captained by skipper James Waddell, which captured 38 Union merchant ships, primarily in the Pacific Ocean. The most famous of all of the Confederate cruisers was the Alabama, also commanded by Raphael Semmes, and this ship captured 69 Union ships in just 2 short years. It wasn't until June 19, 1864, that the Alabama was intercepted and sunk off Cherbourg, France, by the Union warship Kearsarge, captained by John Winslow. It's interesting to learn of the wide-reaching effects of the American Civil War. There was a large number of other Union warships that were captured, and because of this, marine insurance rates were driven up to a prohibitive high. This led to a serious deterioration of the American merchant marine, the effects of which lasted well into the 20th century. This is why the shipping magnates of the time were primarily European, like White Star Line or Cunard Line, 2 English examples. Besides unending fighting with ironclads on the inland rivers, Lincoln's Navy played an important role in a series of coastal and amphibious operations, some in junction with the Union Army. For example, as early as November 7, 1861, a Union flotilla under Samuel Francis DuPont seized Port Royal, South Carolina, and yet another flotilla under Lewis M. Goldsborough assisted Ambrose Burnside's army in capturing Roanoke Island and New Bern on the North Carolina littoral in February to March of 1862. A month later, Savannah, Georgia was closed to Confederate blockade runners when the Union Navy reduced Fort Pulaski guarding the city. And finally, on April 25th of that year, David Farragut, who was running the forts near the mouth of the Mississippi River, took New Orleans, Louisiana, which was subsequently occupied by Benjamin F. Butler's army. Unfortunately, there would be pushback for the Union. Their ships were again repelled at Fort Sumter in April, July, and August of 1863. The Federal Army under Quincy A. Gilmore fared barely better when they tried to assist the warships pushing into Charleston. Farragut would have better luck when he pushed into Mobile, Alabama, and rendered it useless by reducing Fort Morgan and destroying several defending Confederate ships on August 5, 1864, in the hardest-fought naval engagement in the Civil War. The Confederacy's last open Atlantic port in Wilmington, North Carolina, was successful in standing up against a Union naval attack by David D. Porter as they defended Fort Fisher when Butler's army failed to coordinate its attack properly in December of 1864. However, it would fall just a month later when Porter returned and with a well-constructed army assault led by Alfred H. Terry. Galveston, Texas was the only open port for the Confederates in the last months of the war. In short, Uncle Sam's web feet, as Abraham Lincoln nicknamed the Union Navy, was a decisive part in defeating the Confederacy and winning the American Civil War. In total, about 1,556,000 soldiers served the Union, and an estimated 800,000 men probably served the Confederacy, though spotty records make it impossible to know definitively. Traditionally, war deaths have been estimated at about 360,000 for the Union and 260,000 for the Confederacy. However, a demographer used better data and more sophisticated tools to convincingly revise the total death toll upward to 752,000 and possibly as high as 851,000. This astonishing death rate accounts for roughly 2% of the 1860 population of the U.S., and all of them died in the war, leaving a scar on American society. Americans were heavily religious at the time and couldn't fathom how a benevolent God would allow such destruction to happen for so long. This transitional war has been called both the last old-fashioned war and the first modern war, and it had a lasting impact on the development of modern weapons and techniques. This was the first war in which the telegraph and railroad played significant roles, the first to use rifled ordnance and shell guns, the first with widespread newspaper coverage, the first to organize medical care of troops systematically, the first to utilize land and water mines, the first to use aerial reconnaissance by means of balloons, the first to employ a submarine to sink a warship, and the first war in which ironclad warships fought. The American Civil War was the deadliest war in American history, with more than 600,000 dying in the conflict with an unknown number of civilian casualties. This death toll is comparable to the fatalities of all other major wars, including World War I and World War II. This war's brutality, bloodshed, and violence foreshadowed the coming world wars, which would eclipse this war in devastation. Navies played such enormous roles in the American Civil War that it is impossible to look at it without acknowledging the incredible powers at sea. Lincoln rightfully gave them the credit they deserve, though sadly many American children are only taught of the land engagements of the war and very little about the incredible warships that fought for both sides of this war. Who knows how the American Civil War would have turned out without powerful warships to have made such an impact. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Mississippi River ships playlist in the cards. Stay tuned this Sunday for the story of H.L. Hunley, a Confederate submarine in the American Civil War and the first combat submarine to sink a warship. Thank you for tuning into Fast Facts Friday, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you next time.